Sandra realizes the gravity of the situation and tries her best to open the door, but it's already too late, as Sandra is locked outside the car. She tries her best to make the 2-year-old David switch off the vault mode, but he doesn't understand a word and simply keeps on playing with the phone. Later, Sandra panics and starts shouting at the little kid, which startles him, and he drops the smartphone under his seat. Here, Sandra gets to know that the Monolith car's features are not just an advertisement, but it also performs in reality. Even when Sandra tries to break the glass with a rock, not a single scratch can be seen on the window glass. Seeing all her efforts go in vain, Sandra decides to seek other options. She begins walking back to the electrical substation which she noticed before. After some walking, she reaches the station, jumps over the fence and cries out for help. However, she gets no response and the station seems to be empty with no workers present at the moment. After this, Sandra enters one of the rooms and finds some necessary items inside. She takes a flashlight to use at night and a big wrench to help her break the glass of the locked car. Just as she leaves the substation, she notices a wild animal following her. As Sandra rushes back, a coyote attacks her, so she climbs onto the roof of the car. Despite her best efforts to scare off the animal, it remains unfazed. In a last-ditch attempt, Sandra starts banging the car with the wrench and an alarm starts blaring, which finally makes the coyote retreat. Just then, Sandra notices David having difficulties in breathing. Despite the situation, she manages to calm David and he finally starts breathing and soon falls asleep. After a bit of thinking, Sandra too becomes tired and falls asleep on the bonnet of the car. The next day, Sandra wakes up when the sun is already bright. She then immediately rushes to check David's condition inside the car. She finds David weak and feeble because of his hungry stomach and dehydration. One of the features of the car also displays the temperature of the surroundings, which appears to be increasing slowly. The condition is a curse to Sandra as the place is completely isolated with no humans around. Sandra then decides to seek help and follows the road. Despite being severely dehydrated, she proceeds to walk the long journey. She also knows the risks of leaving David alone in the overheated car, but she has no choice but to seek help. Fortunately, she comes across a river where she drinks and cleans herself. After gaining some respite, she continues her journey and encounters steep hills along the path. After walking several miles, Sandra finally comes across an old airfield, where she discovers a jet. Meanwhile, the temperature inside the Monolith car rises up, causing it to instantly start the emergency cooling fan. After reaching the abandoned jet, Sandra enters inside and discovers some alcoholic drinks, a gallon of gasoline, a lighter and a pair of spare airplane tires. She consumes some alcohol and immediately gathers the necessary items. After that, Sandra uses the gasoline to burn the 2 tires, in hopes of attracting help. She then takes the gallon and fills it with the river water. Slowly, Sandra walks back to the place where she left David. In the next scene, Sandra hurries to the car and finds David all weak and turning red. She tries calling him out, but David does not answer or move. The temperature inside the car has increased significantly and the emergency cooling fans have become ineffective. Seeing the state of her son, Sandra immediately climbs the roof and pours the water she brought from the river, but all her efforts go into vain. Thinking that her child will have to die inside the high-tech vehicle, she again starts to hit the car window with the wrench, but it just wastes her energy. Later, Sandra tries to light a fire outside the car in hopes that the sensors will detect the smoke and open the windows, but none of this happens. Instead, the emergency cooling fans stop running to prevent the smoke from entering inside. Fatigued, Sandra falls to the ground and gets a vision of her and Carl visiting the same accident place after a year. There, she realizes her mistakes and still blames Carl for David's death. After some time, she wakes up to some noise and finds it all to be her dream. To make the situation worse, the coyote from last night again appears in front of her. Sandra decides to hide from it and tries to climb on the roof of the car. But as the car's temperature is extremely high, she can't stay there and instead slides below the car. There, the coyote bites her leg, and this is when Sandra realizes that it is the deer that the coyote is after. As soon as the coyote drags the deer out, the car starts rolling backwards. The deer was the reason which had held the car in the position. Sandra immediately gets out from under the car and tries to stop it from sliding backwards. Despite her best efforts, the car still continues to roll backwards, edging closer to a fall. However, a small chunk of rock obstructs the car and it finally stops. As Sandra stares from the cliff, she remembers the cartoon she saw earlier at the gas station, where the diamond was obtained after the safe was broken. She then thinks of pushing the car down to unlock the doors. Sandra is well aware of the fact that her plans might have consequences, but she is left with no other choice and decides to go with it. She grabs the wrench and starts breaking the rock which was obstructing the tire. After successfully removing the rock, Sandra purposely pushes the car down the cliff with David still inside the car. As the car is thrown in the air, its inbuilt AI starts to function and immediately realizes that the car is falling from a height. The features of the car get to work and shift its balance, studying the gravitational pressure to fall upright, without causing any harm to David. Since the car was designed to deactivate the vault mode at the time of an accident to let the rescuers come in, the doors finally open. As soon as the car strikes the ground, Sandra climbs down the cliff and approaches the car. Despite the devastating fall, the car appears as if someone just placed it there. Finding the locked door open, Sandra hurriedly takes David out of the car and opens his clothes to help him cool down. Seeing David's weak health condition, Sandra resolves to get out of the place as soon as possible. Before Sandra gets in the car to drive, the whole system gets restarted. With the help of Lilith, Sandra sets the car into extreme off-road mode and starts climbing the cliff in front of her. The car appears to be made for very extreme conditions and easily gets past the steep cliff. Miraculously, Sandra reaches the off-road she chose and heads towards the hospital. In the last scene of the movie, we see Sandra and David arriving at the hospital. David is kept on the hospital bed beside Sandra and is connected with multiple tubes. Sandra seems worried about David until he opens his eyes and calls her mommy for the first time. The movie ends as Sandra gets delighted at her son calling her out.